you talked about the magic crop, talking about sorghum. Can you explain on this?
Magic crop, I'm just trying to think what I said, that it would solve all the problems.
You said it's the magic crop because it's very competitive in Australia, and farmers are happy to grow it because they earn money out of it.
Yeah, so in Australia it's the reliability that is the key. So in the area where I am working primarily, sorghum is the primary crop because it is the most reliable crop. So they have a choice between maize, cotton, mung beans, chickpeas, wheat, barley, and they grow a range of crops for reasons of managing risk, but sorghum is the dominant crop because it is the most stable crop. And I think many of the problems that exist about the acceptance of sorghum in this situation in Europe is to do with the small volume of production. So if people don't have experience, it's one of these issues of the chicken and egg thing again, the moving from the niche to the mainstream. But certainly in terms of a feed product in Australia, sorghum is a preferred grain for people manufacturing feeds for poultry. So I don't think there should be a problem there. It's a communication issue.
So are poultry units in the same area then? We talked about local production earlier.
So reasonably, as much as you can be in Australia where it's large, but certainly the users of feed are located close to the production areas. And certainly for Australia, the advantage in these areas is where you have winter and summer grain production, because the cost of storing grain is a cost to the whole industry, and it's much more convenient for the feed producers to buy material as it becomes available through harvesting.
Okay. And if we get back to these relations between farmers and researchers, how would your organization be a model, or how does it operate?
It's possible. So the model in Australia for research funding, and it's actually a mandatory levy on sale of grain. So when farmers sell grain, they pay a proportion of the price of that grain to a pool of money. The federal government matches that money, and there's an organisation charged with spending that money to give the best returns to the farmers. And the people in charge of that fund include farmer representatives, so it has a board, so there's lots of interaction between farmers and researchers, identifying problems, prioritising those problems, and then investing in the best solution. So it's not just about genetic change or its management, it's what's the most cost-effective solution, and often not just about a single crop, but also the whole system. So in some cases, crops which do not earn very much in terms of levy are given funding because there's a system value to producing legumes, and that has rotational advantages. So many of the things that you mentioned, but instead of it being legislated, it's being demanded by the farmers in order to remain productive.
Okay, so again, this is something I think we will talk about this afternoon at this afternoon's roundtable with the person from the European Commission, because it's, from what I understand, one of the directions where the Commission would like to go in the next Common Agricultural Policy to get farmers closer to research.
Yeah, I think it's a great way of doing that. I think most researchers like to see their research used and generate benefits for the community. And certainly the farming community has many problems that need to be solved, but developing some mechanism to provide money and to direct research activity towards problems is the challenge. So it's coordination and funding.
Ok. Évidemment, je repasse vers le français maintenant. Et Arnaud, pour vous, votre organisation aussi serait sans doute un exemple au niveau européen, puisque vous faites et de la production et de la recherche. Voilà. Donc c'est des structures qui existent déjà.
Oui, ça marche. Après, ça marche plus. Ça marchait tout à l'heure. Je suis peut-être un peu trop toujours radical dans tout ce que je fais, tout ce que je dis, mais l'Europe, c'est pas l'Australie. En Europe, on est anti-tout. Donc on est anti-glyphosate, on est anti-OGM, on est anti-transgénèse, on est anti-néonicotinoïdes, on est anti-tout. Donc les choses vont très très vite. Et je pense que la Communauté européenne, c'est son devoir aussi de trouver des solutions pour qu'on aille aussi très vite dans l'autre sens. Donc moi je pense que le gros coup de pouce, ça serait, que je le répète, des aides couplées ou des aides très, très claires pour aider cette production, pour débloquer un peu tout ça, parce qu'on n'a pas le temps d'attendre. On n'a pas le temps de penser, de philosopher. Il faut qu'on aille très vite. Et effectivement, je pense qu'en Australie, sa démarche est tout à fait normale, équilibrée pour ce type de continent. Alors qu'en Europe, c'est mon avis personnel, mais je pense qu'on n'a plus le temps d'attendre aujourd'hui.
C'est une belle transition avec le sujet qu'on n'a pas encore abordé, les new breeding techniques.
Yeah, exactly, and thank you for that, because that's really something that we want to address today and deliver some message on that. Because if we want to have innovation in breeding, and if we want to have means to foster this innovation in Europe, we really need to have access to the latest breeding methods. And we saw some presentation yesterday from your colleague David from the Queensland University in Australia about the use and the potential of these new breeding methods. And in Europe, we are at a stage that we are, as Arnaud said before, we are against everything. We are against the neonics. We are against all the science, I mean. And speaking about new breeding techniques, you may know that last July this year there was a ruling from the European Court of Justice, and basically this court interpreted the provisions in the EU Directive 2018, so that's the directive on the cultivation of GM crops, and they interpreted that directive in such a way that all the plants that are resulting from the latest breeding methods are to be considered as genetically modified organisms, as defined by this directive, and therefore they will be subject to the same provision, to the same regulatory provision than the GM crops. So, of course, on that we are, as a seed industry, extremely disappointed by this ruling. We consider that the consequences of this ruling really presents unacceptable social and economic risk for the European breeding industry, but not only. It presents major crucial risk for the whole agri-food chain in Europe, for all of you as consumer, and also for the European environment. So those risks, yes, it's really a risk, because with this directive on GM crops, there are such prohibitive compliance requirements that we will not be able to put in the market crops with those compliance, and with that we are really cut off all from the scientific progress, and we put the breeding industry, but once again the farmers, the processors, the traders, the consumers at a real competitive disadvantage towards some other regions, and we had this presentation by the Australian to really illustrate that. So that's a challenge, and on that. I would like to say the position of the European seed industry, but I think that's really shared by other stakeholders as Copa-Cogeca in this room. So for us, our position is that plant varieties and seeds in Europe are already subject to a quite full and respected and robust regulatory system, and varieties that are developed through the latest breeding methods should not be subject to any other additional requirements or regulatory oversight. If we can prove that the plants obtained through those methods and the plants obtained through earlier breeding methods are equally the same. So yeah, for us that's really a crucial point on that. So yeah, we would like to engage the seed industry, but all of the other stakeholders to engage with policymakers on that and to have really science-based rules in the European Union.
Yeah,
Some word, David?
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment there. As a plant breeder, the GM technology was not really something that we could make use of in sorghum because of the costs of regulation, even in Australia where GM crops are permitted, or even in the US where the situation's even easier. But this gene editing technology will have a massive impact, and it will be very hard to imagine not using it everywhere in your breeding program. And this has, I think, one of the real challenges for Europe is that it will cut Europe off from access to germplasm from the rest of the world. And in a crop like maize, which is reasonably large, that won't be an issue. But for a crop like sorghum, that will be a really major stumbling block for Europe, I think, going forward. And certainly something to try and change, I think. And particularly, I think the real challenge is, and this is the reason I think the regulators in Australia have decided not to call GM, is because you can't tell. And if you can't prove that something's GM or not GM, it makes it very difficult. So you'll be requiring people to sign some sort of an agreement to say a particular line does not have gene editing, and no one will be able to prove that it does or doesn't. Yet if you come from a company, they will be unwilling to sign that because this material will be everywhere in their programs. So it's too hard to prove that it is not the case. So.
We're going to finish now. Arnaud, do you have concluding word for this roundtable, and then we'll go to questions and answers with the audience.
En Roumanie, on est assez, curieusement, on est encore très mal organisé au niveau syndical, au niveau beaucoup de choses, mais le gouvernement encore et la population est toujours pro. C'est un peu l'antithèse de la France, je dirais, je ne sais pas comment c'est en Italie, mais on est plutôt pro-GM. Les GM sont autorisés en Roumanie pour le mouvement 810 de Monsanto, même s'il n'est pas utilisé parce qu'il n'a pas beaucoup d'intérêt chez nous, mais on est pro. On est pro-irrigation, on est pro-néonicotinoïdes, on est pro... on a une autre façon d'aborder les choses qui va certainement évoluer dans le temps. Donc nous, avec la PPR, on essaye de préparer ces changements d'attitude. Mais malheureusement, la Roumanie pèse, c'est qu'un membre sur les 28. Et j'espère que c'est pas une bataille perdue, mais dans cette absurdité là permanente, mais c'est à la limite on a envie d'aller jusqu'au bout, quoi. C'est-à-dire toutes les variétés, nombreuses variétés utilisées en culture écologique sont des variétés maintenant considérées OGM. Parce que bon, c'était depuis 30-40 ans où c'était une mutagénèse archaïque, mais c'était quand même une mutagénèse qu'on faisait. Donc si on veut aller jusqu'au bout, qu'on aille jusqu'au bout, et on verra ce qui va se passer, quoi. Le sulfate de la bouillie bordelaise, le sulfate de cuivre, c'est pareil. C'est pas parce que c'est vieux que c'est bon. Donc à la limite, il faut peut-être aller jusqu'au bout, une bonne fois pour toutes, qu'on voit un peu ce qui se passe. Mais ça devient très inquiétant et décevant, quoi.
Merci beaucoup. Je pense qu'on peut applaudir nos trois intervenants. Ce que je retiens, c'est le sorgho a beaucoup de potentiel, mais on a besoin d'innovation pour passer ce fameux seuil, pour pouvoir développer la production et l'utilisation, la valorisation du sorgho et répondre aux enjeux d'aujourd'hui. Alors la parole est à vous. On a un quart d'heure, un petit quart d'heure, avant de passer aux enjeux climatiques.
Thank you. My question is for Monsieur Rouillard, and is about the very recent statement issued by 12 members of the WTO, actually the WTO statement on new breeding techniques from Geneva. Do you think, which was initiated by Argentina, by the way, and joined by a good number of agricultural powers, including lately by the United States, do you think this statement will have any influence on the European Union decision makers? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for that question. I think on that, yeah, collaboration is really the key element, and we really need to have the help from anyone on that. And yeah, I would like to say that we need to have some statements by third countries, by EU members on that, by the different stakeholders, and I do call the scientist community and the researcher community to really provide impartial, independent studies on the safety of those methods and economics studies to really provide economic studies on the consequences of the losses of not using those methods. So we really need to rely on third parties that are independent and impartial, and also on regulatory systems that are already implemented in other third countries to try to make the change in Europe and to go on the right way and not to go in the wrong direction.
Another comment from this, or okay? Second question? Everything was clear?
Hi, it's great to get all the positive comments about genome editing, because that's what I do. But I do want to add a little bit of a caveat to that, to just make sure that everyone is aware of the fact, and I think the breeding companies are aware of the fact that it's not a silver bullet in its own. It's not going. You have to have good genetics. You have to have very good management. It's part of the whole package, and the way in which you implement that is really important. It has to be done as part of a breeding program, which was one of the problems that GMOs had in the first instance, as that they were presented as this will save you. Without any background breeding necessarily. The other comment I wanted to make was, are you aware that there is a cost proposal on gene editing at the moment, which should have a result come out this month as to whether it's been funded or not? And it's a whole network of people all over the world, including myself, about
on sorghum?
About crop gene editing. And I think that's something that this group, if that actually then gets activated, it would be something that would be very worthwhile for this group to get involved in. There's members of ESA, I think, as part of that.
Yeah, we heard about the importance of crop management as well as genetics, and so it's not just one element; it's part of a whole thing, right?
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment, and I'd be happy to get feedback on it. I think that one of the dangers with gene editing is that we put it in the same box as previous genetic modification technologies. And although it's complex to explain, potentially, I think there are real differences in the way that the technology can be deployed, and the fact that we can, it's potential that you can't tell the difference between an edited genotype and a non-edited genotype is really a good reason, I guess, to believe that it's a more, as safe as any biological product that you eat can be. So I think that's probably an important difference. I don't know what your thought is, Ian, on whether that can be sold as a... Yeah? Okay, good.
So when you say you can't tell the difference, it means it's the same quality, it's the same composition, it's exactly the same product, right?
So one of the ways that I see myself using gene editing is to look at natural variation, and rather than spending 4 or 5 years to put a gene from a landrace from Ethiopia into an elite variety, I'll discover what that gene is, and then I'll make the gene change so that it is really impossible to tell whether I'd done it by conventional breeding or through this editing technique. And as Ian says, it's not going to work for all genes because we're dealing with large numbers of genes as breeders, but there are vital genes that we may want to change that can greatly improve the efficiency of a breeding program. So single gene modification can make something resistant to aluminium toxicity in acid soils. So you could have an elite variety and you've got an opportunity to plant it on acid soils, convert it to this acid soil variety. Perhaps that region was too small to justify a breeding program, but now you have a product that farmers can grow. So that's the sort of efficiency that you can gain without having to worry about taking a gene from a fish and putting it into sorghum.
Species.
So there's a whole continuum of change that you can make.
We have another question here.
I'd like to add, can you hear me? I'd like to add one more thing, because we don't want to become the apprentice magician, like from the Walt Disney movie. Because sorghum in its domestication has taken 300 years, genes up and down with the wild progenitors. So we know that it is outcrossing, and that we have heard in the meeting also that quite a few farmers are complaining about problems with Johnson grass or maybe other sorghum-related sorghum. So as such, we have to be careful to show clearly that the traits that we are interested in, that we are not the magician's apprentice, so that later on we will have something which we can't turn back, because the genes will go into the wild ecosystem. And that may be a reason why governments at first just say, let's see how far we can get without it before we go over to do it. And so to me, these issues then, I think as a scientist, we need to define what areas and what traits would we be safe, so to speak. And we have to, unlike with what we've done with biotechnology, I think a lot of the issues with biotechnology, just adding a new gene to something that is already there was unacceptable for the Europeans. And that to a scientist is almost ununderstandable, because how can you be against something that is more statistically viable than doing an empirical cross, where you bring in drags from foreign genes that nobody talks about. So that process was already rejected. So what we are talking about today is a similar process, but with even better opportunities, what we have heard today. So in order to make our case and not cut our face like we've done with GMOs, we should really identify as scientists, and maybe that's worth a meeting, which traits are of essential interest. And we've seen that even in this case, traits that we are interested in as secondary bring in major gene or major improvement. So this is something where we have a new tool that we should really defend as much as we can by showing where we want to go.
Thank you. Your neighbor has a question.
Yes, very fast. I was intrigued to hear that you have this kind of a levy that you are collecting from the farmers for the research in Australia. And I think that this is one thing that we are also more and more looking now in Europe as well, how to make sure that you will get the involvement of the farmers. But a question about this levy, is this a voluntary or is this a compulsory levy? That's the first thing. I mean, we know that that's not always so simple. If it's a voluntary, you will always find slippage away from paying it, etc. And then also you said that you have their governing body that are then consisting of academia, you had politicians most probably, but also farmer involvement. And how does this one work? How do you pick then the research programs that you would be able to fund as well?
Okay, so it is a compulsory levy. I think there is opportunity for farmers to decide that they want to, not be part of it, but that requires, sort of a voting system really. Which in turn requires that the organisation delivers to farmers and they see a good return from it. So it is legislated, so there is legislation associated with it. But if the farmers felt that they were not getting a good return on the investment, there would be pressure to not pay it. In terms of the organisation, it originally started as it is a semi-government organisation. So it has, it's a corporation, has a board which contains farmers, researchers, not politicians, but certainly business people from outside of agriculture and in agriculture. It has a CEO, and then it has program leaders, which are technical people, and they interact with farmers at the local level through, they have a range of different people, but there are panels that represent regions, and on those panels there's a mixture of farmer representatives, research representatives. Actually, one of the other Australians here was a member of those panels. Perhaps you want to say something, Loretta, about how GRDC works and interacts with the farmers. Is that yes? Yeah, I think.
You have 1 minute.
1 minute.
Thank you. Thanks, David, I think. So I was a member of the Northern Panel, so there's 3 panels across Australia, a Northern region, a Southern region and a Western region, which basically occupies the 3 geographic areas of Australia. Within each of those panels there's about 10 members who are made up, as David has said, of researchers, agronomists and growers from across that region, and we were basically given the task of meeting with growers across our region and researchers and prioritising what were the issues, and then actually, I suppose it's a bit of a liaison with the Grains Research Development Corporation staff, so the actual body that administers the funding. We would work with their staff to talk about what budgets were available and then what would be the priorities for funding. So it is a competitive space for the research community, but it also gives us a voice for farmers and for the industry to actually have an influence over where the money is spent.